Arizona PBS is proud to support Indian Country Today. For 6 decades, we've provided television programs and now digital content. But we go beyond that, sending outreach teams across Arizona, offering workshops in language and literacy, family engagement and community outreach, and supporting tribal communities with early learning and school readiness resources. Join us at azpbs.org.
This is Indian Country Today.
Esquili, yes, thank you for joining us. I'm Patty Loew. Here are the headlines from Indian Country Today. The American Indian Policy Institute at Arizona State University is releasing a new article outlining ways to maintain Indian country's electoral power. The article comes as a wave of legislation targets the voting rights of Americans across the country. In states with Native American communities, Indian country was able to turn the political tide nationally with voter turnout. The Institute says that bills are now seeking to make it harder on voters in rural areas. Navajo Nation leadership says these bills place an extreme burden on voters living within rural tribal lands. The Policy Institute says Native leaders have to be creative and proactive in their responses to restrictive laws. These efforts, they say, will make sure access to the ballot stays open for everyone. The pandemic has brought many challenges, some even financial. Credit card use has dropped dramatically since the pandemic, which raises a red flag for possible inflation. Inflation occurs when prices rise due to the increase in production costs, like the price for raw materials, as well as employee wages. Patrice Chumash is a lawyer and an economist. She established the Center for Indian Country Development at the Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis. She says she's concerned for the future if people aren't careful.
You know, more spending leads to higher prices, and it's a supply-demand issue. And what we really want to be careful is that we're spending prudently, we're spending on necessities, we're not spending beyond our means. I do think we're going to be able to manage inflation, but it's always a concern when we have a surge of spending.
To help inflation, Chumash's advice is simple and time-tested. Only buy things that you actually need. The Oregon Senate approves a House bill that makes Indigenous Peoples Day an official state holiday. The holiday will be celebrated on the second Monday in October. Oregon joins 10 other states in recognizing the significant contributions that Native Americans have made to the U.S. The bill was brought forth by the legislature's only Indigenous lawmakers, Representative Tana Sanchez and Teresa Alonso Leon. The lawmakers hope to encourage everyone to learn about and celebrate the state's Native communities. According to data from the University of Oregon, nearly 140,000 Oregonians are Indigenous people from Central America and Mexico. The state is also home to 9 federally recognized tribes. The bill passed in the Senate after passing the House and now goes to the governor for approval. Contestants on the show Top Chef recently had the chance to cook with some Indigenous foods. The show features chefs who compete against each other to create unique dishes. In a recent episode, they featured the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla in Northeast Oregon. The Umatilla eat bison, antelope, elk, rabbit, deer, and steelhead fish. They also have a number of greens and vegetables they use in their cooking. But before the tribe decided to be on the show, they wanted to make sure the food and the traditions of the tribe would be respected.
So when they asked us to work with them, we wanted to make sure that we were going to be seen in a good light, especially when you're talking about your traditional foods. It's very tricky. We have always been taught to guard them, to be, to protect them, but also we are working to restore and educate, and we go out and do that in a public manner already.
In the elimination challenge, contestants paired up to create a surf and turf dish, which featured local fish and game from the tribe. A Native American comic book shop in Albuquerque, New Mexico, is launching a new anthology and a show. The anthology is called A Howl and features werewolf stories from Native writers and illustrators. And the new show, Indigenous Dreaming, is a live Zoom broadcast featuring interviews from Native creators in the comic and sci-fi industry. Lee Francis is a Laguna Pueblo citizen and founder of the Red Planet Books and Comics. He says Native representation in a story is everything.
Maybe if I told the story about your community using a visual graphic, right? And I think that's where we have it's not an unknown audience. It's an audience that has not been exposed to this before, right? So maybe if I tell that story, I say like, let me tell the story of, a Lakota community or Pueblo community, or this superhero or that superhero that's different than you've ever seen before. Maybe that's what draws you in, because it looks like somebody like you. It's a story about your grandma. It's a story about, your history.
The comic anthology will be ready at the end of the year, and you can check out the new episodes of Indigenous Dreaming on Red Planet's website. And those are the headlines from Indian Country Today. I'm Patty Loew. This is our Memorial Day program, and we are taking a look at what Memorial Day means to Indian Country.
When we come back, we'll meet some relatives of veterans who were killed in action. This is our Memorial Day program, and we wanted to take a look back at the history of Native Americans who have served in the U.S. Armed Forces. Joining us today is Patty Loew. She's a professor at the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University in Illinois. She also produced several documentaries. One is Way of the Warrior, which won several major awards. Welcome, Patty.
Oh, thank you, Mark.
Your documentary looked at the challenges of warriors. Maybe tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, well, it goes back to something that Tom Holm calls the Indian Scout Syndrome. Native Americans have always been used by the military as frontline warriors. Part of it has to do with stereotypic notions about crazy stereotypic notions that somehow Native people can see in the dark and can look at a single bent blade of grass and read volumes into it. And this willingness to push Native soldiers out in front, and everybody feels safer with people who really know what they're doing because they're bloodthirsty warriors. And of course, that has had tremendous ramifications for Native people. They find themselves disproportionately pushed into extremely dangerous positions, and because of that, suffer greater casualties.
Well, in fact, you're not too far from Chicago, and during World War II, when the Bureau of Indian Affairs was located in Chicago, it actually promoted that with the whole idea of Indians at war and Indians at work. And John Collier himself edited these stories about Native contributions.
Right, and I think there's a lot of pride in Native America about the fact that we do serve disproportionately at rates greater than other communities in this country. But there's also confusion that somehow that makes Native people more patriotic. And really, in my experience, talking to some of the veterans that I've interviewed, it was all about serving their country, not necessarily the United States of America, but it might have been the Ho-Chunk Nation or the Menominee Nation or the Creek or Choctaw Nation. But certainly military recruiters have used that warrior ethic and really used it in their campaigns. You look at Native, and even in I'm thinking about some of the video commercials and promotional materials that the military has used. They've really promoted that warrior ethic and used it specifically to appeal to Native Americans.
Well, when you think about that ethic and the costs that it's associated with, and maybe think back starting with World War I to World War II, about the real casualty that impacted not just the people who lost their lives, but their families and community?
Absolutely. And at one time, I'm told that Pershing considered putting war paint and feathers on frontline Native Americans who were volunteering in droves from Indian boarding schools because their lives were very militaristic, drilling in the morning, marching to the dormitories, marching to, the mess hall, marching to their classes. And so they, marched right on into the training camps in the front lines of the American Expeditionary Forces. And they were, the military command actually was thinking about putting them in war paint and feathers because so many of the Germans had grown up with Karl May, who had written these overly romantic stories about Native American warriors, primarily Apache warriors, and Germans were frightened to death that they were fighting, quote unquote, red Indians. But because these Native soldiers, and there were, somewhere between 12,000 and maybe 20,000 Native Americans who volunteered to fight in World War I, including my grandfather, who I always thought, stood up there and took the oath to defend the Constitution. He wasn't even a citizen, and most of them, most of the others weren't either. And yet they suffered casualties that were 5 times higher than any other group in World War I. World War II is the same thing. You see these tremendous recruitment efforts coming out of Indian boarding schools, the 45th Infantry, the Thunderbirds that drew from Cherokee and Choctaw, and primarily some of the boarding schools in the Southeast, and I'm sorry, in Oklahoma. And again, that unit was the first to see action in the motherland in Germany, and suffered tremendous casualties. Korea, I'm thinking about the story of John Rice, who was killed in Korea, and in heroic fashion came back. His body was returned a year later. And during his funeral in Sioux City, Iowa, the cemetery director called everything off, saying he can't be buried here because this is a whites only cemetery. And eventually he was interred in Arlington. But it's really interesting, conflicting relationships that Native people have had with the U.S. military.
I want to ask, do you think it's changed? Is the generation now looking at it differently?
When I talk to people, there was this question about whether the combat that so many Native Americans are interested, so many Native Americans are not interested in, whether we can broaden out that definition of warrior to include people that fight for language and fight for their culture and fight for, their communities. So I think that's a discussion that's going on in Indian country.
Dr. Patty Loew, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll be right back with a look at one family who lost a son in Vietnam. Beginning in 1954, American forces were deployed to Vietnam. It was a brutal war that killed more than 3 million people. More than 58,000 Americans in the armed forces were either killed in action or went missing. Among those killed was the brother of Reggie Pagaling. Today, Reggie is an elder in the San Ynez band of Chumash Indians. He joins us now to tell us about his brother, Michael. Welcome, Reggie.
Good morning.
You were a pretty young man when all of this happened. Tell us your memory.
Wow. Well, you started this by saying in 1954, the year I was born, and my brother passed in 1969. So this is just a little over 50 years ago. So as a young man, I remember him being a very athletic man. He'd gone off to the service, and we were very proud of him. And, his nickname was Michael Peter Pagaling, Peter for Peter Rabbit. And so the last time I remember him was really the chance I had to hunt with him and watching him chase down a deer with a .22 rifle. It was quite a sight to see, looking across the canyon and seeing your brother chase a deer down and harvest it with just a .22. Gosh, hard to say so many words about him. You know, it's just with this Memorial Day, it's always something different. My family was very proud of him. I remember my older brother and I talking, and my older brother was Manuel. He said, you know, he was a draft dodger because he had knee injuries from playing sports and wasn't going, but that was never the case. Very proud to serve in the service, like many Native American families. He was in that small circle when we talk about Native Americans knowing each other. As I grew through my life, I actually ran across veterans from throughout California that talked to me about my brother. And boy, just brought back not only honor, but tears of joy.
How much older was your brother?
I think I was 11. He was 19 when he passed. He went into the service at 18 years of age. Left for Vietnam, I believe, in October of '68 and passed January 2nd, 1969.
Were you able to find out some of his stories about what went on when he was there?
Yeah, you know, he was a man of small stature. He was 5'4". He was 100 and I believe just under 120 pounds. So if you've heard the stories about Vietnam, they needed small men to go in for those tunnel rats to go into the tunnels because many of the Vietnamese are small people and they used the land. They were smart people. They were natives. And it was a shame that we as brothers had to fight our other brothers.
There's so much now about Vietnam that we didn't know back then. And it's kind of made it probably more difficult for Memorial Day because you want to honor the person, yet all these other controversies surface. How do you navigate that?
You know, when I look at that, and I took a moment to look over the history of my brother, looking at his platoon when he graduated, platoon 279 out of Camp Pendleton. It's just really a tough one to actually realize when I go back and look at even what they sent us in the family, that this country recognized my brother's gallantry by being recognized by the Vietnamese government. It's very interesting when I look back at that. I'm searching to see if the United States government did anything for my brother and maybe other Native families. I'm not sure, but there seems to be a gap in where we need to really step up and ask this country to honor our veterans. When I see the country of Vietnam respecting them, South Vietnam for fighting on behalf of the South Vietnamese country, and he got 2 medals from South Vietnam, not the US government. It's kind of like, what the hell? But at the same time, I know my brother had no qualms. As a matter of fact, I've got 2 nephews who just completed service, graduated from the Naval Academy. They served their time as pilots and as infantry. So there's been no qualms on my family and my family's history for us to go forward and protect ourselves, protect our families, and very proud of him, proud of Native Americans serving in this country. Every time there's an honor song for the veterans, I'm standing there on behalf of my brother. There's no doubt about that. We're just proud, like many Native American communities, to be there for our families. And I think that's the bottom line for us. We're there for our families in our community. It is an honor for me to go ahead and talk about my brother, Michael. You know, Peter, my brother, I still have those vivid memories of running up in the mountains, being out there hunting, and how I was blessed. And I realized how I was blessed to watch him, to see grow a young man. The last part of that story of hunting that deer was way up in the mountains. There were 3 of us and my other brother. And as we harvested that deer and come down the mountain, I was the smallest, and we were so long hauled down, and it was a grassy mountain. We found a piece of cardboard, stuck that deer and started riding it down the mountain. ride it down pretty fast until my brother saw a barbed wire fence. And that's why I remember this story. So they hop off and I ride the deer until it crashes into the barbed wire fence. I didn't get hurt because I lied up against the deer. But that's the best memory I have of my brother. It was a wonderful trip. He took me hunting on this last trip.
Thank you so much, Reggie.
Thank you.
The Luxembourg American Cemetery is the final resting place for more than 5,000 World War II soldiers who died serving their country. Sergeant John Mercer is one of them. Sergeant Mercer is the great uncle of Ivy Vainio. Ivy joins us today with her husband, Dr. Arne Vainio, who wrote about visiting the grave in a column featured in News from Indian Country in 2019. Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Good morning, Mark.
So tell us how you found the grave and the story associated with it.
Yeah, so Sergeant John Mercer is my great uncle and my grandmother's brother. And I've always been interested in family connections and family history. And I knew about John, but my family didn't know, his siblings didn't even know what happened to him. They just knew that he died in the war. They didn't know where he was buried or anything like that. So I started searching and researching John. And to make a long story short, found him at Luxembourg American Military Cemetery. And I emailed them and let them know who I was. And then they sent back some information about his missions. They sent a picture of his grave site with his grave marker, and that was so powerful to receive some information about him that my family didn't even know. And so, yeah, so then Arne, my husband, had this great idea that we should take a trip out to Luxembourg. And that's what we did in 2013 to honor my great uncle and our family. And it was so powerful and so moving to be at the gravesite.
You think about the phrase you used that to me is chilling, in that he died in World War II without having any context or story. And we're a storytelling people, so that story is what connects us to why someone went and what they did while they were there. What did it mean to you to find out more about that story?
It just kind of sealed some unknowns for me and for my grandmother. He was a year older than my grandmother, and they came from a big family, 15 brothers. Their mother was Frances Beargrease Mercer, and you know, he came home for a couple of visits, and then in his uniform, and I have pictures of those gatherings and stuff, but then he was so young and then went off to war, and it just, you know, and then nothing. Then he passed on, and that's what they knew, and his body stayed in Luxembourg, was buried in Germany, and then transferred over to the cemetery, and then nothing. And so decades later, for me to find this information out for the family, and for us to go there, was, I can't even describe what that did for us and my family. And his brothers, a couple of his brothers were in this service, and Korea. My Uncle Mally was a Korean War veteran. And when we came back from the cemetery, from that trip, I called Mally and I said, "Hey, Uncle Mally, we're back from the trip, and we got to stand at your brother's grave." And he was so thankful. Like, he was like, we don't, you know, we would never be able to do this ourselves, to go pay tribute and give honor to my brother, but you were able to do this, you and Arne, and we're so thankful that you could do that for us. And so just doing that for family is more than anything.
Arne, what did it mean to you to be able to arrange this and to make this all happen for your family?
To be there and to be among 5,076 white crosses in all perfect alignment and birds flying around, and it was a really peaceful scene. And to be able to see Ivy sitting by Johnny's grave was powerful in and of itself. And I had a recording of of Ivy's grandmother. I went to go visit her and just recorded her on my phone, and she was talking to her brother, and she's 95 now, she's still alive, but she was 89 at the time, and talked to him and said, most of my brothers are with you now, and for her to be able to actually speak to him, and she spoke to him as if she was standing there with us, and it was powerful and it was beautiful.
Thank you so much. You honor us with that story. Ivy and Arne Vainio, thank you.
Thank you. Miigwech.
Thank you.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. Join us again tomorrow and online at IndianCountryToday.com. Thank you for watching. I'm Mark Trahan.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run. Standing Rock. This is Indian Country Today.